Welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm your host, Dmitri Alperovitch, Chairman, Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitics think tank in Washington, D.C. The topic of today's podcast is the Strait of Hormuz and what the options are for the U.S. military to reopen it. My guest is retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. He has served for more than 3 decades in the U.S. Navy. He was J3, or Director of Operations at Pacific Command, and Commander of Carrier Strike Group 5 on USS George Washington. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you for having me, Dmitri.
And Mark, I believe that even Admiral Brad Cooper, who is currently head of CENTCOM, used to serve with you. Is that right?
Yeah, he was in Korea when I was in Japan and in Pacific. I got a really strong, positive feeling about how good a leader he is and a manager, and I'm completely confident in that part of this operation. His ability to execute orders given in the Middle East. And I would say one other thing, which is that he went to 5th Fleet, then Deputy CENTCOM Commander, now CENTCOM Commander. So few officers at the 3 and 4-star rank have as much time in Central Command as Brad Cooper.
All right, well, let's talk about those options. We're recording this on Sunday, March 22nd. It is day 23 of the war that U.S. and Israel launched against Iran on February 28th. And the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed. There are ships coming out that Iran has blessed, obviously their own tankers, as well as some of the tankers that are allegedly paying them off to be allowed to come out of the strait, but majority of the traffic is stalled. And there are several primary threats that are facing those tankers, right? There is talk of mines, although as recently as this past week, Secretary Hegseth said that we have no indication that mines have actually been deployed yet in the Persian Gulf. So that threat may still be theoretical. We know that some of the tankers have been hit by these fast attack boats that the Iranians have, and they're launching missiles of those soft attack boats. But those fast attack boats could also be used as sort of suicide kamikaze boats to try to hit tankers. And then there's the anti-ship cruise missiles that they at least used to have a fairly large arsenal of that they could use from the shore to hit those ships. And finally, drones, probably not the Shahed drones, but smaller variant, shorter range that they could use to try to hit some of those ships. Is that about the threat landscape that these tankers are facing right now, Mark?
I think it is. And as you said, I think the thing that's been the one thing I've seen that's unusual is the use of not just the unmanned craft, but as you mentioned, the manned craft with guys with RPGs or rockets of some sort, so that not quite the one-way mission that the Ukrainians are always on, but some mix of that. I just think there's a lot of threats out there.
And, the Ukrainians are using unmanned surface vehicles like the Magura drones that very familiar with. I know you spent a lot of time in Ukraine looking at that. But so far, we haven't seen Iranians deploy that type of capability. But Mark, let's take this one by one. You had General Kane, the chairman of Joint Chiefs, of course, give a press conference this past week talking about how you now have continuous, or not continuous, but patrols of A-10 Warhogs patrolling the Persian Gulf that could potentially attack those boats. You have strikes on mine-laying boats that the Iranians have. What else do we need to do to actually reopen the strait? How do you see it?
So I think that they need to continue the whole 4 to 5 week campaign, because I think embedded in that are the strikes on like mine stowage facilities, as you said, mine-laying facilities, cruise missile stowage facilities, the places where we think they might hide the cruise missiles. I tend to think that there's a missile problem, as you said, missile, drone, mine, and attack craft. Each of those is being worked over. And I think if you look at the limited strike information we get, it looks to me like the maritime areas are getting special attention now. And probably that makes sense, because in terms of the ballistic missiles really had appeal. That was really after energy suppression of enemy air defense and some of the attacks on IRGC leadership. I think the ballistic missiles were probably target set 3. So we are seeing a lot of these things destroyed. And so in my mind, Admiral Cooper's trying to establish what is the minimal military, how can I get this condition down to an acceptable military risk to conduct convoys? It's not nothing. You can't say the only way I'm doing a convoy is a Commodore or a 1-star or Central Command commanders. I've removed everything. You'll never get there. It's like that asymmetric, like watching a line try to approach zero, next measure line. So, I think there's a point where he says, I've minimized the risk to an acceptable level. I don't think we're there yet. I still think we're a week or some number of days away. And then when he's assessed all that, when his BDA's in, his reattacks are done, at some point he's going to say, "Hey, I've met that minimum risk. I'm ready to start doing it." And then you got to make sure everything else is brought together to get the next step done, which is establishing convoys.
So, literally, as we're recording this, there's news coming out that there's heavy strikes by the U.S. in the south coastal areas of the country, Bandar Abbas, Kharg Island, and other areas where they're trying to soften Iranian defenses. But look, you mentioned the ballistic missile program. We've been hitting that program, the launchers, the stockpiles, for 3 weeks now. And even though the rate of launches of ballistic missiles has declined by over 90%, I published a daily report on the number of launches. They're holding steady in the 20s right now, and even spiked to 30s on average in the last week post the short-lived escalation that we had with the strikes on the oil facilities. So we haven't been able to eliminate that threat. Why are you confident that we can eliminate the cruise missile threat entirely, or are you saying that we'll have to accept some of that risk?
No, that's part of the risk. That's a good point. That's exactly the risk. Look, I do think the numbers will get low. They started much lower than the ballistic missile numbers, the anti-ship cruise missiles. But I think we'll have to accept that. There'll be some number of cruise missiles still remaining. What I don't think there'll be is an ability to do an integrated 6 or 10 missile swarming strike, right? I just think that would be hard. And here's the other thing. General Kane referred to the A-10s, but if the A-10s are out there, there's some fighters out there, top cover, making sure that they're secure because they're not air-to-air capable aircraft. But if you were to do convoy ops, you would have, I think, 4 cap stations of 2 aircraft each, F-15, F-16, F-18. Cap is combat air patrol. I think what they would do is they'd have 2 missions on them. They'd have the advanced precision kill weapon system to take care of any drones they see coming out. They're probably the most effective thing on that. Not the cheapest. The most effective, the cheapest is the A-10 because those bullets are not that expensive. But you got that. And then they'll also have air-to-ground munitions. And anyone who pops their head up and is seen on imagery, and they'll be immediately targeted. You'll have stations it'll be this layered defense with stations of fighter attack aircraft, 10s and armed helos. Because I'll tell you, A-10s at night over water, that was not on my bingo card of stuff I've seen too much in a long military career. Armed helicopters over water, particularly Navy ones, I've seen my whole Navy career. And even the Army has gotten pretty good at that over the years. So probably you'd have a mix of armed helos and A-10s. A-10s are cooler and get there even much faster, but both of those would be okay. But when you get back to the cruise missile, that's a great point. This is why there has to be. I've heard a couple people talk about, do you really need destroyers in the convoy? Yes. I mean, unless a couple merchant ships that have anti-ship, air defense systems, I think I'd want to have some cruisers in there, and some destroyers in there, and I'd want Aegis air defense destroyers if I could get them. I think they're the most capable and a beautiful ship, even if the president doesn't feel so. I'd have them personally. I'd have 2 per convoy in there, and they're set forward slightly. And when I say forward, I mean northerly towards the threat. I think you'd keep your air defense ships in that kind of slightly inboard, in the transit, and then outboard in the return transit, so they're closer to the cruise missile threat. Because you're not removing anyone who says all cruise missiles are shot. I mean, that'd be a pretty ballsy J2 to say, we've eliminated every cruise missile. I just think it's impossible to know they've gotten everything. So I would assume there's a couple of them out there, and they have a couple different variants. Most of them are the older Charlie 802, but they have other variants. But most are the older silkworm-based Charlie 802, which is a stolen Chinese or re-engineered Chinese design of a 600-knot, fairly large warhead anti-ship cruise missile.
So you say 600 knot. When you look at the width of the Hormuz Strait, it's tiny, right? I'm sure you've cruised through it many times. That's not a long reaction time if an anti-ship cruise missile is fired at you, even for an Aegis destroyer, right?
Yeah. I was trying to count the number of Straits of Hormuz transits, but I think most surface warfare admirals like me have 25 or more transits each way, I'd guess. So yeah, a lot of them, and they're always stressful, and they were never risk-free in your mind. Although today it's even more so. Now look, is it narrow? Yes. I mean, you're going to have 11 or 12 miles of water minimum, though, from Iran to where the ships are transiting. and they have about a 6 mile wide scheme to work in, which we would try to stay in. More importantly, though, I don't think it's not like they're rolling the tell out to the water line, right? Water's edge. If you want us to shoot you, that's the easiest way. Make it easy for us. They're going to be back a ways, like I think like the Lebanese do it, massed inside a building, rolled out very quickly, so it's going to be 5, 10, 15 miles into inland Iran. So you're going to have 15 to 20 miles at 600 knots. I mean, the math on that is,
It's seconds.
it's 10 miles a minute. And so, it's somewhere around 60 seconds, maybe 80 seconds. And depending on the missile and how it's launched, you may not get initial detection. I mean, you might get initial notification, something happened, and you start training your radars. But then, I mean, the good news about Aegis is it's pretty good. This is not a F-35 coming at you. You're not trying to find like a bumblebee. It's more of the old Greyhound bus. We've got some really cool systems like CEC, which allow us to exchange firing quality track information between the two DDGs. So if it's head on one of them, the other one's seeing a Greyhound bus. Anyway, there's all kinds of cool stuff like that that make me feel like it's defendable. Now, if you told me they can launch 8 of them simultaneously in stream rates, I'd be a little nervous. But I mean, that's the kind of risk management Cooper's supposed to do, Admiral Cooper, is get you so that, okay, that's not reasonable. We have eliminated the ability for that to happen. Now let's assess what's reasonable and make a decision whether or not to do the convoy.
So you're going to have destroyers protecting against cruise missiles and presumably a few of the drones. You're going to have Apaches and looking out for fast attack boats, looking out for drone threats as well. What about the mines?
So first, my guess is that there's a point between when you say the risk is manageable and the first kind of transiting that happens are the littoral combat ships with their minesweeper packages, minesweeper module packages, and Aegis destroyers defending them. Because although they have some defense, though what we just described would not go near as well on an LCS, right? That kind of air defense would be they have a point defense system, which you don't want to rely on. So that you would have destroyers with the LCS as the LCS sweep the channel for your first runs. Even though I think you do that no matter what, even if your intel tells you they haven't laid it, even though you haven't seen one, I think you still do that mostly to make the merchant ships comfortable and to make the insurers and ship owners comfortable as well.
Now, right now, as far as we know, there are no LCS in the region. They were there, and then they had been moved, I think, back in January, first through Malaysia and then to Singapore, where they believe they're based now. And then we also had last fall some old minesweepers in the area, and those have been moved out of the area. So I don't think we have any minesweeping assets, is my understanding right now. Is that how you understand it
I
too?
think so, but I think the LCS can be there on time at the right time if necessary. In other words, the one thing about the LCS versus a traditional minesweeper is it goes at different speed. I mean, you'd have all the package in on board and you'd transit at LCS speed and get there pretty quickly. Look, I can think of a lot of reasons they're in Singapore. Some of them are pretty cool. Some of them can be, hey, we've got a new type of minesweeper system. It just came out, just got certified. Let's install it on all 3 of these ships as fast as we can. That'd be a really cool reason. I can't guarantee that's the reason. I have no special information that makes me think it's that reason, other than that usually happens in the Navy, and you pull them out and do it. So I'm hoping that's what it is, because we should tell the Trail of Tears about the LCS here, right? So the LCS was, depending on the sea frame, 6 to 10 years late, significantly over cost. Each of the mission modules, the Minesweeper and ASW, was very late. Eventually, really, the Minesweeper is the only one that we're effectively fielding right now.
ASW, anti-submarine warfare.
And anti-submarine warfare. And the Minesweeper one, we had to get done. I mean, it didn't matter that parts of it weren't working. It's been changed, not significantly, it's been changed. Things have been removed from the package because they just didn't turn out to function right. But the older Minesweepers, the ones that were withdrawn, were old, and their systems were themselves kind of Rube Goldberg-y and not working that well. So, and I can remember routinely the C4, the worst, the you can't do the mission at all casualty reports were routinely more associated with the minesweepers than any other ship. This is back in the 2000s, 2010s. So I think they were hard ships to maintain 20 years ago, even harder today. The planned divestiture of the older minesweepers from Bahrain has been on the books since 2019.
It just seems like it came at the very wrong time, right?
It did. Now, here's the other thing I'll tell you. Well, I don't know how functional they were at the very end. The other thing I'll say is like the Minesweeper. I mean, the LCS with this Minesweeper module package. It's late and much more expensive than we thought. The F-35 was late and more expensive than we thought, and then it turned out to be pretty kick-ass. So, being late and more expensive does not necessarily mean a failure. I mean, you can be disappointed in it, but it may succeed. So we'll have to see. I mean, we'll have to see how they do. We'll have to see how it performs in a real operational environment. Now, one thing that does make you a little nervous is these haven't been operational that long, judging by how recently the old ones were pulled out, right? So with that in mind, you're like, wow, we're putting something right into the game. I mean, this is not, and that worries you a little bit. You kind of there's value that the Navy testing, and we pride ourselves on the build a little, test a little, learn a lot, right? And that's how Aegis was built. And what you have here is building, delivering really late, testing as much as you could get done, and before you can learn much, you're in combat. That is not the normal model, and so I'm hoping it does. I'm hoping they do well. It sure would be nice if other people who are professional minesweeping navies were to join us in this.
Now, is there another option, which is, you hear a lot in this town in Washington, D.C. about the new defense tech companies, the Andurils, the Saronics of the world that are building these unmanned surface vehicles, unmanned underwater vehicles, some of them claiming to have some mine detection capability. Could we use some of those? There's obviously the Maguras that the Ukrainians using that are pretty modular and you can deploy various sensors on it. Could you see some sort of unmanned solution to this mining problem?
In fact, what's on the LCS is an unmanned vessel. It puts an unmanned vessel in the water with different types of detection gear, sweeping gear. It also employs a helicopter that does the same thing. So that's in fact what we have. Now, my worry is what we have, and the problem at this late a juncture is integrating these systems so they work well together is the hard part. That's the secret sauce. So even if a company had a really good UUSW, as you mentioned, an unmanned undersea vehicle, if they haven't built the mine detection equipment already and tested it, if they have that, then they're in the game. And even if they only have two or three, you're in the game and we'll pay for it and figure it out later on. I don't know that exists. I suspect it doesn't just yet, because you and I both know that the kind of people who run those companies and they like to talk about how ready they are to do something. I think we would have heard by now that I'm holding the secret sauce. So I just don't think we're there yet, but you're right. Long term, I mean, you described what we've been trying to do and not doing well at it. When you look at the unmanned surface vessel, they call it a CUSV, Common Unmanned Surface Vessel. In terms of the littoral combat ship mine module, it has been painful. And what's equipped on it isn't what was originally designed to be equipped on it. So it hasn't gone through the developmental process fantastically well. And the airborne stuff, I think, is using kind of old technology in terms of sensing and sweeping, just from a different helicopter. Look, do I think there's other technologies out there in terms of lasers looking down and things like that could be on other systems and brought in? You bet. And I hope they're being extremely creative and imaginative in putting that together. And like I said, I can name 10 navies: Japan, Korea, Australia, Germany. There's a Dutch-Belgium combined fleet on this, Poland, Lithuania, Norway, the UK, and France, all with good minesweeper fleets.
So it sounds like we have one of the worst.
Well, I don't know if we have the worst, but we're doing a transition that everybody else is watching. Can you transition to the kind of a higher speed mothership that has other capabilities and yet can still do minesweeping on the side? Because no one likes to have dedicated, except for those very small navies I mentioned, like Lithuania. They're like, yeah, minesweepers is a good thing. Estonia, that's our navy. There's a couple minesweeper ships. I mean, I know they claim more than that, but that's really their navy. And it's a certain skill set that we don't fixate on in the U.S. Navy. It would be the most gentle way to say it. And because the other way to say it is we kind of ignore it, most of our officers. So, it would be great. This is one of those things that, like, in the big spread of NATO work, we always said, that's your job. Like, we never stationed, in the last 40 years, haven't stationed minesweepers in Europe. We've told them that's your job. And they don't transition. They don't do well going across the Atlantic. They get put on in the Pacific, they get put on big ships and scurried across that way.
So there's a lot of focus on the Strait itself, which is very, very narrow, as we've discussed. But you also have this massive Persian Gulf, right, that's behind the strait, that is also, I mean, it's much wider than the strait, obviously, but it's still a fairly narrow passageway. And in fact, a lot of the attacks we have seen on these tankers that have occurred in the last couple of weeks have not happened in the strait. They've happened closer to Iraq border, up the Persian Gulf, and elsewhere. And when you think about convoys, are you thinking about a convoy just through the strait, which is very, very small and can be done hopefully pretty quickly? Or are you thinking escorting all these tankers from their original embarkation points in Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, all the way across the Persian Gulf through the strait? Because seems like a much more difficult task
No,
and much more expensive.
I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of people tend to say, well, this is a 40-mile thing. It's, 10, 12 knots. Or they put some higher speed on it that isn't realistic. And they're like, well, you're done in 2 or 3 hours. Not at all. You described it properly, which is there's at least a 50 to 60-mile transit separation scheme leading into it, which is how the vessels flow in. Then after that's another 40 to 50 miles to like Jebel Ali, and then Abu Dhabi, and then ports in Bahrain, Qatar, all along the coast there, and another 40, 50, another 60, 70 miles all along there. And in fact,
And even once you pass the strait, you're still within range of Iranian missiles
there's a
potentially. So
vessel
you have to
transit
escort
scheme.
them through the Gulf of Oman too.
That's right. There's a vessel transit scheme on the backside of another 30 miles, and I think you're right. You would release them at some point a little bit after that. Here's the constraints I tell you is you're gonna have to have destroyers on the back end of that to kind of defend that area, in the Gulf of Oman. And then you're also going to have destroyers at the bullpens where people come in to be collected and put in order and brought. And so, and if I were a merchant ship, I'd probably want to head to a bullpen right away and just sit behind the Navy destroyer and figure that'll keep small boats away for sure. And it'll probably shoot down cruise missiles and drones headed at me because it's not sure if it's not headed at them. And those are good assumptions by the merchant. So I think they will get around that. So you'll have bullpens. They may give them another terminology. We used to call that years ago. Then you'll have in the transit scheme, you'll be escorted the whole way. So that's not a 40-mile transit. That could be 160 miles easy, from the entry through, and as you said, at the backside, at which point, I think no matter where you're going, you probably head due south at about 20 knots as a merchant for like 150 to 200 miles, until you really feel at that point, you'll burn the gas and then turn port or starboard to get to where you're going.
And that's assuming you're not going to face the Houthi threat on the other side.
Yeah, in case you're not sweeping around to go right up the Bab el Mandeb, going up and head into the Red Sea, then you get another. You're going to probably get another escort. So we'll have to see how we play that. But I assume that as well. So that's why this is not 6 ships or 4 ships. I've heard these really small numbers. I'm like, no, I think this is 10 to 14, maybe more U.S. Navy destroyers. To kind of
do we even have that many right now in the region?
Yeah. So as you know, we have like 75 commissioned, 74, 75 commissioned out of 5 more that are in, delivered to the Navy, but still kind of working out, 10 being built. That's the kind of 90 ship fleet right now. And we're building more despite the president not liking the ship because it's, quote, ugly. The Arleigh Burke is a beautiful 75, like I said, 75 ships. I think that produces 45 or 48, some kind of, hard to say the exact number, but my guess on my mental math of watching this, that could be available for these operations, but they're spread. Some are in workups. These are ones just not in maintenance, not in modernization. Ones that are in workups are ready to go, of whom I think, 18 to 20 are probably in the CENTCOM AOR right now. And that means they're going to get a chunk of the rest of them over time. I think they'll get another, if I were running things, I'd give them another 8 to 10. So they have 26 to 30. And so then they can plan all these. Now, some of these are dedicated. A couple of them have to be off of Israel for the, defense of Israel against the IRBMs. And in case we were concerned, in case we weren't sure about it, the Iranians recently demonstrated a very long-range IRBM that really, I think your only really good chance against it, your best chance against it, is going to be an SM-3 of the weapons that are in the AOR right now. So we need to keep destroyers around Israel. We may or may not be protecting Cyprus right now till the Brits show up. I'm not 100% sure.
I think the French are showing up to protect
Good.
Cyprus.
That'd be better. Carrier strike groups. Someone other than us would be great. carrier strike groups have, dedicated destroyer support.
Yeah, I was about to say, so we have the Abraham Lincoln. Now the Ford just went to Cyprus, but the Bush may or may not be coming in. So you need destroyers to protect them as well.
That's right. 3 to 4, and depending where they're going to operate. And like I said, in the rest, and then you're going to need some in the Red Sea, in the Bab el-Mandeb area. That's not a freebie anymore. Never was. And I think we've kept people around there as is right now. So yeah, we're spread out, but I think they can get to this number. I mean, the good news is, again, people like say, well, CENTCOM must not have planned on this. I promise you, Straits of Hormuz was it was not even in like a branch plan. It's in the plan, right? You know what I mean? And they have like 17 or 20 or some ungodly number of branch plans. Don't worry about it. The plan had Straits of Hormuz. They knew, we've all known this was going to be an issue if we had a all-out conflict with Iran. And I guarantee you, and Brad Cooper responded, he's like, hey, I'm working down that risk. I don't have to worry about where everything is at this exact moment because that risk is not low enough. What he will be unhappy about is if he gets the risk down to a manageable level and he turns and his Fifth Fleet commander says, it turns out I didn't have the DDGs ready, or I didn't have the minesweepers in position, or I didn't have my contribution to the attack helicopters or my contribution to the overhead airborne. I think the Air Force will be ready because we've driven down the risk, fighter planes are available, right, to do that cap. The A-10s are always available because I don't think we're putting them feet dry over Iran, to my knowledge. And like I said, the helicopters are available. So we'll get there. But you're right. One of the long poles in the tent is DDGs, which is why I was glad to see they've been added to the reconciliation. There was 2 added to the reconciliation. Hopefully the DoD budget that comes in. And we continue to build the Flight 3 DDGs because you cannot have enough of these.
Yeah. Just Aegis Destroyer is really critical. Let's talk about one more thing that's getting a lot of attention now, which is Kharg Island, right? And that's of course Iran's main export terminal. It is up there in the Persian Gulf. I don't understand the obsession with Kharg Island, to be honest with you, Mark. Maybe you can help explain it, because taking Kharg Island, I don't see how it helps you to secure the Strait of Hormuz. You still have the mines, the fast attack drones, the anti-ship cruise missiles, everything we just talked about would still be a threat even if we own Kharg Island, right? And then secondly, Kharg Island is within about 30 miles off Iranian shores. So you could potentially hit it with artillery from Iranian shores. You can definitely hit it with multiple launch rocket systems, not to mention drones. So even if we were to take Kharg Island, it seems like we'd be sitting ducks there. And I'm not sure what we would actually be accomplishing, because people talk about Kharg Island as the only export terminal of oil that Iran has, but in fact, it has a bunch of others all up and down its coast. So even taking Kharg Island would not prevent them from exporting oil.
Well, you're spot on. I mean, I don't get the obsession with the Marine unit being used ashore anywhere, but particularly Kharg Island. And first, by the way, I'm for the Marines coming, because we need someone to do what's called non-combatant evacuate operation. There's a chance that some country gets so pissed off at what the U.S. has done that they start to storm our embassy. And so you always want to have the Marines there to do what's called a NEO. So I'm glad we're bringing Marines in. By the way, put those ships as far away from the missile threat as you can, because we're not going to give you DDGs. By the way, because, if they were to go to Kharg Island, I think I'd want to give them 5 DDGs just for them. Forget convoy ops. I mean, okay. Let's talk about Kharg Island. You're absolutely right. There's 2 reasons to take it. One, because I want to own the fuel from it. Well, let's say you're successful. You grab it. They don't have to send fuel out. They'll just turn it off on the other end. 2, I want to stop you from taking it. I can think of a much easier way to do that. You say out loud to as many merchant ship captains as you can, the next merchant ship that goes to pull up to get fueled there, one of the spots is going to be sunk 1 mile out. And then when a ship starts to approach, because they don't believe you and they're 5 miles, although you're starting to believe the American military right now in the Gulf, but let's say you don't, you're 5 miles out, we warn you, hey, you've got a mile or 2 and we're going to sink you. At 3 miles, we say, we really mean it. I would begin to abandon ship. And at 1 mile, you sink it. Close enough to the fueling spots that everyone knows why we did it, but far enough away that later on we can pull in and go by it. And we know how to sink this in a way that doesn't cause too big an ecological problem. But on top of it, that's a message to every other Iranian shadow fleet merchant commander that your engines may not be working today when asked to go fuel up at the Kharg Island.
Better than sinking it, why don't you just board it like we do with the Russian shadow fleet and seize it?
Yeah, we could do that. I will tell you, I think Kharg Island might be even closer to the mainland than at 30 miles. It might be more around 18 to 20. But it's close enough to me that you could do that, because this is soft going in, who I think are, What I wouldn't want is a heavy footprint getting 18 miles away, because then you need all kinds of destroyers to protect them, everything. But if you're just going to do like a level 4 SEAL team insertion, you know, you may or may not shoot people, but you definitely take control of the ship. You have a small Navy prize crew that then drives it due west to Bahrain. That's another answer.
Or you can just wait on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz and just get it on the way. On the way.
This is more about not having ships. The U.S. feels embarrassed by the Iranian ships coming out. By the way, we have not done a very good job seizing these ships on the way to India, to my knowledge.
We're not seizing any of them. In fact,
Yeah,
we're about to start buying oil from them, right?
yeah, I know. So, I mean, that's a whole nother level of what the heck is going on here. That definitely not in the CENTCOM war plan. That's in the Besant war plan. But the CENTCOM war plan
Oh,
was,
they're trying to keep oil prices low as best as they
yeah,
can, but
yeah.
that's not going to accomplish a whole lot.
Yeah. Yes, but there's all kinds of ways to handle Kharg Island other than seizing it, which I agree with you completely. It's unnecessary. I get we can do the mission, but that's way unnecessary risk to force. The president has done a good job. The president has a strong commitment to not having U.S. troops killed in action. He really, I believe, I take him at his word there. Cooper and Kane have delivered him a war plan with minimal casualties, 8 combat casualties and 6 air safety, air crash casualties, to my knowledge. That's a very reasonable, for the kind of combat that's been going on. That's an expected level of casualties. None of them are acceptable individually, but collectively, you kind of understand it. My point on this is, you start doing boots on the ground in either somewhere around Bandar, or somewhere in the Straits area, or Kharg Island. I think you're taking way too much risk, and I think you described it.
Given what you're describing, particularly around the number of destroyers we're going to need and the number we have in the region, it doesn't sound like this is something that's going to happen in the next week, right? First of all, getting them to that region is going to take a week or more, depending on where they're coming from, and then obviously destroying some of that infrastructure, taking down the risk is going to take time as well. We're talking many weeks before we could even start doing those operations. And then once we start, how many tankers could you reasonably escort through this convoy mechanism? Is that going to be sort of the level of shipping that you had before the war? Or is it going to be substantially less?
So a lot of questions in there. So I do think some of these things happen simultaneously. The ships are flowing, and they've been flowing. The minesweepers are an interesting question, though, for sure, if they're still sitting in Singapore by having got underway. But the bombing's still taking time. So these things can integrate together, and I'm confident they're running a war plan to do that. But you're right, that's weeks. Then potentially a sweep for a week. Then convoy starting. And the convoys, if you had 5 Commodores, they'd give you 5 convoy schemes, right? 5 plans, and all of them are right and all of them are wrong. I mean, in other words, I can prove that there's too much risk to force in any one of them or too much risk to mission in any one of them. But if I were balancing it, I would the first couple of days do 2 convoys of 3 to 5 VLCC, very large merchants, with a couple destroyers with each one, 2 destroyers with each one, maybe even 3 the first day, just while we kind of get a sense for the battle space. So, you'll bring out 7 to 8, ships. Then I think I'd be bringing out 14 to 16 at 2 million barrels apiece, 14 to 16 million barrels of oil, or slightly less on the oil and a little bit of LNG and a little bit of fertilizer, but some mix in there. And then after a few days of that, then you increase the number by 1 extra convoy, and then the next day by another convoy. Convoys day or night, I don't think that we fight pretty well at night. Missiles and drones aren't better or worse at night. I mean, floating mines would be easier in the day, but this is better not be a floating mine problem. And by then, you have helicopters sweeping ahead. So I don't think the floating mines. The one thing
floating mines create a problem for Iranian-owned tankers, right?
Yeah, they do. Yeah. Yet, to my knowledge, they haven't been placed. Hey, something I should say about the Iranians. The last time they planted, when I was involved there, was they put them by the entrance they were trying to put them by the entrance to Bahrain when we jumped them. I mean, that's how far away they were from the Straits of Hormuz when they're trying to mine. For the exact reason you said, they wanted to catch merchants or U.S. Navy ships coming out of the port there. And we grabbed the ship. I think 10 of them went in the water, and we grabbed the ship while it still had about another 14 mines on board and seized the ship. My point on this is they could mine, like you implied, almost anywhere in the Gulf. And so you have to be looking everywhere for them the whole time. But I think I don't think normal comes very quickly. I think normal is an issue of months. Normal being like 37 large ships a day going through. That could be a couple months, but normal, I've resolved the oil problem and begun to resolve the fertilizer problem. That's weeks
From the start.
from the
Now,
start.
with the mining, we've been hitting these mine lane vessels. And my understanding is these mines are very heavy, right? So you can't just like throw them off speedboats or something. You need specialized equipment. So can we get some confidence that maybe we've actually managed to destroy most, if not all, of the mine lane capability and that we don't have to worry about them?
So I've seen them try to do mines. Like in the case I'm talking about, it was not a mine laying vessel, which by the way is why we actually attacked them twice, attacked them with a set of helos, then came back and attacked them again because they couldn't get the mines in the water for the exact reason you said. They're heavy and they didn't have like the crane and other equipment to kind of get it off. So can you throw them? I mean, a dhow might be a little small, but could you get them on a fishing boat and get a couple in the water? You bet. But you couldn't lay a field anymore. I think that's what we've removed is the idea that not that they were doing like a Hague compliant, Hague Convention compliant minefield, but they're getting, they could lay a few with non-traditional craft if what they're trying to do is terrorize people and then film it and then send it out saying, look, we've mined, you don't know where.
So there's another more fundamental question here, which is I perhaps made a mistake in making a very public prediction a week ago that this war might start wrapping up in 2 weeks, which is about a week from now. Could be proven very wrong on that prediction. But what I see as a big issue with the Strait of Hormuz reopening is that you can't really do any of this stuff that we've just talked about, the convoys and everything else that we're talking about, without the fundamentally the end of hostilities. Because Iran can look at those convoys, and even if they can't hit the convoys, they can still throw ballistic missiles at the port facilities, at the oil production facilities, that whole infrastructure that is onshore in Saudi Arabia, in UAE, in Bahrain, and Kuwait, and Iraq, that will essentially make this whole issue moot because there won't be any oil to put on these VLCCs and transfer out of the Gulf. So don't you have to have an end to the hostilities before you can really start talking about opening up the strait?
I think what you have to have, I think you're right in a sense that in a couple weeks we may transition to stabilization. And I think that's where, so I would say in between, there's full scale combat operations where we're doing, between us and Israel, 500 to 1,000 strikes a day. Then there's stabilization. I'll talk about that in a second. And then there's the winding down where we're setting up some kind of permanent presence where maybe we patrol over their skies when we feel like it. That stabilization is where we still have a lot of combat aircraft in position to strike on constant, up there just waiting. Not Northern Watch kind of waiting. I mean, really heavily armed kind of waiting. Maybe even a bomber or two with 48 or some high number of JDAMs or JSOW or whatever you want to load in there because they can load a lot in the belly. And that's going on so they can hit the ballistic missiles that start to come out, things like that, if they do. And then around the Gulf, all the stuff I talked about with the F-18s, the A-10s, all that's still going. And what you say is, okay, I think the risk is low enough. We've hit them hard enough and long enough that they really can't come out. And then you start, and that's still, like you implied, a week to 2 weeks away. And then you've gone to stabilization where you're still flying a ton of missions. You're just not delivering as much ordnance because the enemy is not showing itself. And you strike things as they come apparent. You defend the assets and you begin to open the strait. Then after you've done that for a couple months, and you measuring the J2s, measuring how much stuff we see, what we hear in chatter, what the Israelis hear in chatter, and then say, okay, we're at the point where we can transition out of stabilization. But that could take a while. But again, if you're doing it right, it's without boots on the ground. It's mostly air power enforced, and it's air and maritime power enforced to allow the transit through the straits. Because the goal here is I know the president never really said our strategic end state. All we have is a very good description of ways and means by General Kane, which is only two of the three elements, right? Your strategic end state needs to be said. I've always thought, well, it clearly wasn't regime change because we didn't do any of the proper preparation work for that. We don't have an armed interventionist.
Well, actually, if you look at the strikes that have taken place since February 28th, none of the regime targeting has been done by us. It's pretty much
That's right.
all been Israel. Both Kane, Hegseth, and Admiral Cooper himself have consistently since day one talked about three priorities: ballistic missiles, Navy, in ballistic missiles, the defense industrial
And
base, as well as the
yeah,
launchers. And then the nuclear program, which we also haven't hit because I think we pretty much hit everything we could in June. So, you look at that and you say defense industrial base, according to them, is destroyed. The Navy's sunk. Nuclear program, even though we haven't destroyed it, there's still the 60% enriched uranium buried in Isfahan and a few other places, but you probably can't get there without a suicide mission. So you probably have accomplished pretty much everything you needed to accomplish. Let's wrap it up, and then let's figure out how to open up the Strait of
and then you got
Hormuz.
the stabilization. And what I would say is, I would describe that strategic goal, if I was the president, the White House, I would say it wasn't regime change. It was change the regime's ability to impose its will on Arab neighbors, Israel, and the United States. And we have changed their ability to impose themselves. And the whole idea is, if you do it well enough, and their missile defense programs set back 5 years, their ballistic missile program set back 5 years, Navy 7 years probably, because you can't build ships easy when you have no shipyards and facilities. Drones is only a year or two, because you can build a drone factory pretty quick. The Russians have demonstrated that. Nuclear programs set back a little harder measure. Air defense, 3 to 5 years, at least for indigenous air defense production, because we've destroyed the production facilities for all that. You've created the conditions where the Arab neighbors in Israel can create a different set of rules in the Middle East, a different level of cooperation, a Middle East that is not dominated by Iranian-backed terrorism. You could do that. That, in theory, I wish we'd said that was the goal on day one. It'd be an easier sell to the American people. I think that ways and means are starting to achieve that. One thing you can't do with all that is leave Iran in charge of the Straits of Hormuz, because if you are, you really haven't set them back in terms of the eyes of their Arab neighbors.
But you potentially made it worse because now they have a deterrent against future strikes. Well, let's hope all this happens. We'll see how it plays out. But, in your estimate, Mark, we're at least a few weeks away from being able to buy down the risk, getting the destroyers there to start working on reopening the strait, and then maybe several months or longer till we are back to quote unquote normal pre-war levels of shipping. So we've got a ways to go unless there is a diplomatic solution that opens this up quickly.
Yeah, it's a fair estimate. And the only thing I'd say is, the good news is, I think we would prioritize the oil for the reasons that have been said here. And we can get to almost normal oil if you add in the 2 pipeline additions that have been occurring in weeks, not months, from problem start.
Yeah. The pipeline from Saudi and UAE going to the Red Sea. Of course, there we still have the Houthi problem, which we've
Yeah.
been lucky that they haven't engaged against the ships there, but they might. Do you have a theory, by the way, on why the Houthis have not re-entered the conflict like Hezbollah did?
Yeah, I will say first that I think our strikes on the Houthis last year, and upon further assessment, were fairly effective. Now, that is not why they're not doing it totally, but I think the real reason is that right now, with the Strait of Hormuz being controlled by Iran, they don't need to act. And I think the Iranians are watching Hezbollah get slowly taken off the table. They may be holding their cards on the Houthis, not encouraging. And the only thing that surprises me is the Houthis are not known for restraint in anything, and they're showing a lot of restraint because they could be shooting right now.
It is possible that they want to conserve their missiles because before they were getting replenished from Iran, Iran does not have the production capacity to replenish them anymore. So they may want to hold on to their arsenal as long as they can.
I think that's a good reason. I think, and waiting until there's a rich target set as the Saudis start to really send stuff down the straits.
All right, we shall see how it plays out. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us. And again, stay tuned for the developments in this field. Take care.